everyone, I'm Stephanie Arell. Today I'm going to be talking to you about first the differences in sympathy and empathy as I envision it, and the different types of empathy that we're capable of having as a capacity. And that's a really important word because people talk about what empathy is and is not, and I think at base, empathy is something some of us have inherently, but other of us have to work at it because it's a capacity. It's not just something that we can rely upon that's, like fear or sadness. The impetus to do this video, there's two. One, a student asked me in class, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? And I think there's a big difference. Second, I've been talking a lot about shame, and I think I mentioned in 2 or 3 videos before this that part of what helps shame is our connection with other people. And part of that relates directly to empathy. In fact, the logic of empathy is very similar to shame's, only they're opposites. So what does that mean? In shame, people want to withdraw. In lowered sense of self-worth, people feel as if they don't have something to contribute to a relationship with another. Where empathy is exactly the opposite. I'm sharing my experience and interchange with the other. I'm vulnerable to the other, and I'm capable of enjoying, imagining, and connecting with the other. So these are 2 different experiences, right? And maybe in a later video, I'll particularly show you how the 2 experiences are opposite but relate to one another. Part of the way that we get out of shame in terms of empathy is having eye contact with other people, really deep, meaningful eye contact, or alternatively, or just along with, laughing. So laughing together with somebody can actually ameliorate the shame experience. So empathy is really important in that regard. But how is it different than sympathy? Well, the way that I like to describe it, and the way that I described it to my student in class, is that sympathy is like feeling for somebody. Empathy is feeling with somebody. And those are different experiences. And the way that they metabolize themselves in our human community is often related to power. So in sympathy, if I'm feeling sympathetic for somebody, there is already in that experience a structure of hierarchy. I feel good and I feel bad for someone else. That might function well. That might be helpful. But it's worth reflecting on in terms of distinguishing sympathy from empathy. When I have empathy, I'm actually with the experience of another person. If somebody feels sad, I'm able to come into the sadness with them and almost share the experience. Potentially, that alleviates some of the sadness of the other. Very different than walking in and being like, wow, I feel sorry for you. Think about that. If I say I feel sorry for you, I immediately create a power relationship where I'm on top and the other person is not. So one of the dynamics that occurs then with the difference between sympathy and empathy has to do with this almost poking at somebody. Okay, so if I have pain in my life and I feel like somebody sympathizes with me, they are feeling for, their experience is created as being better than the experience I am in. And potentially what that sets up is my envy, my jealousy, my rage even at the fact that maybe I don't have what they have, which is this sense of goodness that I'm not experiencing, or alternatively, I have their pity. And that pity is the thing that's kind of like a little fracture in our ability to feel whole perhaps, or also a communication by the other that something's wrong with the situation that has to be fixed, and then somehow I'm wrong, and that gets very messy, right? So pity, sympathy, again, it's not that they might not have a role, but there's potential that they turn into distress, violence, anger, other experiences that aren't helpful to us. In fact, sympathy might be well meant, but it might not feel well meant. So it's perfectly possible for someone to say, I sympathize with you, and the reaction is, well, why? What's going on here? You know, I feel what I feel. When there's empathy, it's a totally different experience because there's no projection of value over my experience and your experience. And in fact, it's more of thinking about sharing something so that the empathic exchange isn't going to create or set the fertilizer for creating any kind of feeling of rage or anger. Hopefully. I do think in the empathic moment, though, we may have shared anger, which is not the same as sympathy either. I think one way to think about sympathy and empathy is to think about our grieving processes and the reality that any particular grieving process, which can be done over any loss, person or a thing. So I like people when they think about grief, and I'll do a later video on this, that grief doesn't have to just be over a person. Of course we grieve the loss of somebody, but we can also lose things. We can even lose ideas that we had, the way our life could have been that isn't. When someone else comes in and sympathizes with us, it can have multiple effects besides our own defense mechanisms. Maybe we're experiencing a loss, but we don't experience it so strongly, but someone comes in and enacts their pity or their sympathy on us, and it creates a feeling of maybe self-doubt, like, should I feel worse about this? Or, wait, I was handling the situation fine, now I feel worse. So we have to be careful about how we mobilize our own sympathy or pity towards someone else. I also think that this gets into issues of charity. You know, when we're gonna do something for somebody, are we doing it because we feel sympathetic? Or are we doing it because we really wanna help? Is that help grounded in our desire to create a power structure? Or are we actually thinking, hey, I wanna contribute to this person's worth, well-being, agency? So questions like that can help us analyze, where am I at this moment? Am I empathic or am I sympathetic? I really think that's important to think about related to charity, because when we tip somebody, when we donate money to any given institution, are we doing it because we feel sorry for people, or are we doing it because we want to contribute to the growth of that particular group or organization? And it might not matter. Maybe it's just good to support organizations and not analyze it so deeply, but I do think it's worth thinking about, because I think that when we create systems of power, if we're not reflective on how those operate at the benefit of others and the benefit of ourselves, and even critical of how that operates for the benefit of ourselves, then we create slippery slopes. Let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about empathy and how empathy functions, or what the capacity actually is in our own lives. And the way that I like to think about it, and there might be more expansive ways to think about it than this, but I like to think about it in 3 different categories. Somatic empathy, which has to do with our neurological system and our mirror neurons. Affective empathy, which has more to do with what we would typically conceive as feelings or emotions. That's sort of what I alluded to before, our feeling with someone else. And then the third category is cognitive empathy, which actually has to do with our thinking through or imagining somebody else's experience. So all 3 of those have similarities, but they're also distinctively different in terms of what capacity within ourselves that we're utilizing to engage in any kind of empathic engagement, or what some people call empathic attunement, which is this idea that when we're with someone else, we will really want to be attuned to their experience, and that enables us to more fully be available to the other person and our own experiences simultaneously, which leads to intimacy, shared growth, joy even. Backing up, what does it mean to say somatic empathy? Now, I'm going to give you 2 different examples. One has to do with just a casual exchange of watching television, literally, or watching a sport. And the other has to do more with thinking about a therapeutic environment. And those of you who engage in any kind of care practices for other people, it might be worth thinking about this second category. So the first category is when you are watching any kind of sport or something on television where there's intensity. So for me, that's watching gymnastics. If I'm watching Simone Biles on the beam, I literally, if I'm really, have a nice enough image to do this, I literally jump when she jumps. If she goes into the air, my body does this. When she's in the air, I feel a little fear, like, oh my gosh, don't fall. Luckily, she never falls, so we have a gift in watching Simone Biles. What is happening because of the mirror neurons? I'm watching her body move, and my body, even my muscles, actually have a firing response that is similar to what she's working in that experience. So people that, for instance, are watching basketball and someone throws the ball into the air and your body kind of goes up, you're actually physiologically and neurologically mirroring what you see. It's actually a very good way to learn. So if any of you guys dance, or if you have any kind of body coordination, or when I work with traumatic clients, sometimes I'm working with people that don't have use of a particular arm, watching the body movements can actually help you learn them. So dancers use this all the time, right? You can't think through how to move your body. Instead, if you watch somebody and then you try to mirror that, that's the mirror neuron capacity. That's somatic empathy. In terms of a clinical setting, so what would happen with a therapist or potentially somebody, if you guys are in any caretaking position, or, even it doesn't have to be that kind of clinical environment. You can think about a friend even. So when you see somebody's body position and you're with them long enough, and even I think this gets into how if we're in a relationship with somebody, we start to look like them. It's not that our face changes, but we may change our expressions because we're developing expressions like the person we're with all of the time. That's somatic empathy. People's bodies position are contagious. So if we're sitting around people that are like this all day, we're likely going to start to develop that posture because we have empathy with the people we're around. Alternatively, if somebody is in front of you and they're having an emotional experience of any kind and you're trying to understand it, although understanding is a little tricky, like can we really actually understand somebody else's experience or can we only imagine it? But if you are trying to get access to what that person might be experiencing, assume their body position. So if they're sitting like this, you may want to do that, and then that gives you some signals about what they're experiencing in their body and potentially in their mind. It's a very good strategy for therapists because if they can't capture the feeling that someone's having, if they kind of take on their body position, they'll get some information somatically, somatic empathy, in relationship to what that person's experiencing. So effective empathy is this, what I'm categorizing as the second type. Effective empathy has to do more with our feelings, our emotions. Technically, it really has to do with affect. And affect are more simple versions of what we usually think of as emotions or feelings, which means that they are sort of biological, physiological urges in our body that stimulate us, and then we attach words to those affective experiences and they become feelings. So the affect is that physiological, biological urge, which there are about 9 basic affects that hit us, and then we use words, feeling words, to categorize those and to understand them intellectually, right? So I have this impulse or kind of energy that goes through me that leads me to smile to see you. That would be, the affect is joy, but it becomes a feeling as soon as we start to associate it with, I felt so happy to see you. Now all of a sudden it's changed slightly, but there's a physiological experience that gives us the information that we attach words to and experiences to. And the more we say about it, it becomes kind of at the level of emotions. What's important about knowing that is that we have these physiological, biological experiences that we use feeling words to describe, but which we share with other people. And so the capacity to have effective empathy is when we can identify sadness and we can feel it. That's an effective response, right? So if we're around somebody that's full of joy and we have this urge of joy, that means we're empathically attuned with that person. If we're around somebody who's angry and we're capable of being angry with them, or to feel their anger and understand it, again, understanding's a little bit tricky, but if we're able to connect with it, connect's actually a better word. If we're able to connect with that anger, then we're in this capacity of effective empathy. So there is an overlap between these categories of empathy. So don't just think about it as isolated phenomenon. For instance, perhaps that you see somebody that's having an experience of anger and you recognize the experience, but you don't have access to it. But you start to think through what's behind the anger, and you've come to some deduction that they're scared of something, or perhaps they're actually really sad, but expressing anger instead of those emotions. Now we're getting into the realm of cognitive empathy. So what cognitive empathy is that it's your ability to imagine what someone else is experiencing. You're actually thinking through it, right? So maybe you have some more information and can tell, okay, wait a minute, they're not really angry about this. Our experiences are complex, but in terms of thinking about how we flip emotions, right? So how we have anger when actually we feel sad, or we experience an anger oftentimes when actually I'm encountering somebody who's super angry. I'll ask them what they're afraid of, and then I get a lot of information about what the fear is that's motivating the anger. And so I know that what I need to do is talk about what the fear is and then address that so that the anger becomes less potent. But it makes me think of COVID. So a lot of people were irritable during COVID, or had, withdrew, or felt depressed. But what they really were experiencing was a lot of mourning, a lot of sadness at losing opportunities, not being able to go to high school prom. I mean, how many of you guys got angry at someone else because you were grieving some really deep experiences that would have been around had this, well, it's complicated, had we not had society shut down as a result of COVID. So when we're thinking about cognitive empathy, then what it is that we are now asking our intellect, these big powerful parts of our brain in the front of our brain, less in our lower brain, which is more effective and immediate response. We're asking these higher parts, or our higher capabilities at cognition, to help us imagine other possibilities of what could be the case for a particular affect. The other thing that cognitive empathy is if somebody's telling you a story about their experience and it's not an experience you've had, now we get into this word understanding, it's really going to be impossible for you to understand their emotional response to any given situation, to understand what's at stake in their situation. But you can imagine it. You can think through it. And that can help you have the capacity for empathy, not sympathy, but empathy to the situation. When you can imagine the experience of another, then you're more capable of feeling with the other. A favorite scholar of mine, and I'll leave you with this, Edith Stein. She was a nun who was originally Jewish, and she was a victim of the Holocaust. So becoming Catholic, which was a choice she made prior to the threat on her life, but becoming Catholic and becoming a nun did not save her from the Holocaust. Edith Stein calls empathy the psycho-physical, spiritual becoming of the self. I like that conceptualization because it means we work at it, first of all. We work at it psychologically, we work at it physically, and we work at it spiritually. So if you can think about that in terms of these types of empathy, the somatic is our physical capacity to empathize with another person. Our spiritual, actually, we can take the whole, right? To think about the whole experience of establishing empathy and developing that capacity as a spiritual exercise. And the psychological has to do with both the cognitive and the affective capacities to feel with another person. Thank you.